Hi everyone, welcome to the Halloween Foreign Object special, Frankenstein and Philosophy, with Borna Radnick and Corey McCall. So I'm just going to briefly introduce the topic and kind of give a summary of the presentations that Borna and Corey are going to give. So they say, Frankenstein is often read as a cautionary tale about the dangers of scientific and technological progress, and hence as a book with conservative political implications. While this is in no doubt an important feature of the novel, scholars have argued that it is also a book that wrestles with the implications of radical politics and the legacy of the French Revolution. Warren Montague, for example, argues for the book's revolutionary implications despite the fact that the French Revolution is never mentioned directly. Montague and other Marxist theorists claim that the monster represents the dispossessed masses, which renders Frankenstein a story with both profound moral and political implications. So how does our understanding of the novel change if we take the Marxist suggestion to read the monster as a figure of the dispossessed masses? So that's what Corey will be talking about. But first, Borna will be presenting, and Borna will be talking about what makes the figure of the creature in Frankenstein so abhorrent and horrific. So Borna says, Victor Frankenstein's reaction to the reanimation scene in the novel suggests that the creature's monstrosity touches upon what Kant calls the sublime, namely an experience that cannot be given categorical form, and indeed evokes feelings of boundlessness because it points to an epistemological failure. So Borna will argue that the creature induces such dread and horror because he or it resists or eludes ontological and epistemological categorization. By drawing on the work of Kant, as well as Alain Badiou, Borna will interpret the reanimation scene in Shelley's novel as an event, i.e. an occurrence that engenders an ontological rupture and destabilizes epistemology. Ontologically, Frankenstein's monster functions both as a reminder and a remainder of the abyssal, unground, or void in Badiouian terms, at the center of being. This is what is so existentially unsettling and uncanny about the creature. So I'll just quickly also introduce Borna and Corey and myself, and then talk a bit about how I'm going to kind of run things a little bit so we all know what we're doing and when people can get involved. So Borna is a PhD candidate in philosophy at the Centre for Research in Modern European Philosophy at Kingston University in London. His articles have appeared in journals including Continental Thought and Theory, Radical Philosophy, and Crisis and Critique. He is currently completing his doctoral dissertation, the working title of which is Hegel and the Double Movement of Necessity and Freedom. I love working titles because I'm always changing my working title. So Corey McCall was, until recently, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Elmira College in upstate New York. His research and teaching interests focus on intersections between various traditions in modern philosophy and literature, focusing on Caribbean, African American, European, and American traditions. His current projects include the forthcoming edited volume, Decolonizing American Philosophy, and serving as guest editor for an issue of the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy, entitled American Reflections in French and Francophone Thought. He has also co-edited the collections Melville Among the Philosophers and Benjamin Adorno and the Experience of Literature. And just to really quickly introduce myself, I'm Sabine Chowdhury. I write fiction, poetry, and theory, and I'm also, like Borna, based in London. I'm also, like Borna, doing a PhD at Kingston, but in the media department, researching love in relation to contemporary media technologies. And I've got a few bits of fiction, bits of work, an article on Scott Walker's Sonic Geopoetics at the moment in the Journal for Cultural Research, another one on ghosting forthcoming in Chiasma soon. But I won't bore you with all that bio talk for ages. So now I will really quickly just say how things are going to work, because I don't want us to get kind of like confused and chaotic. So I'm going to hand over in a minute to Borna to present to us, and then Corey will present. And then after that, Borna, Corey, and I will have just a brief discussion amongst ourselves, kind of relating their two presentations, looking at the resonances and the incongruities. And then after that, we'll kind of broaden the conversation and maybe talk about some broader themes as well. And we'll open it out to everybody. At which point you can either wade in if you want to, so you can literally just enable your audio and talk, or if you want, you can also register that you want to ask a question in the chat. And sometimes that's easier because then we're not all talking over each other, so I can come around to you. Or if you are shy or you get anxious about talking and you don't want to be seen, that's absolutely fine. You can put your question in the chat and I will read it out for you to Borna and Corey. So I'm going to stop talking now, finally, and hand over to Borna.
Great. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. Happy Halloween. Right. So, so the blurb that Sabine graciously read out is essentially a summary of what I'm going to talk about. So, as a novel, Shelley's Frankenstein contains many philosophical and also theological ideas and themes and concepts. I mean, these are all relatively well known, and I'm not going to list them all here. I'm not really interested in that because, you know, we can think about what it means to be human or inhuman and things like this. That's all well and good. But one of the central arguments that myself and Corey, we've kind of discussed and thought about is, what if we read the novel itself as a work of philosophy, right? In what ways can the novel perform philosophy rather than simply containing philosophical ideas within it? That is to say, the novel, specifically for my presentation, the reanimation scene in chapter 5, performs what I will call a revolutionary event. This is following Badiou's notion of the event. In order to make this claim more explicit, however, I suggest to interpret the reanimation scene in the book on meta-ontological levels, or rather a meta-ontological register. And the term meta-ontology or the meta-ontological is again Badiou's term for what he does in Being an Event. And I'll get to that in a second. So for this reading, for this revolutionary evental interpretation of the novel Frankenstein, I think it only really makes sense, however, if we first examine the reanimation scene in chapter 5 from a phenomenological and representational level first, before moving on to the more ontological dimension. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to first kind of talk about the reanimation scene, and then I'm going to draw some parallels between it and cinematic adaptations or cinematic representations. And then finally, I'm going to kind of problematize that and then maybe quickly talk about what I think is going on ontologically in the novel, also outside of the novel. So for anyone who has read the novel, and I hope you have read the novel, if you haven't, please go and read it as soon as possible. I hope you would agree with me that the reanimation scene in the book is kind of perplexing and baffling. It's very strange. I would even call it enigmatic, because the reanimation scene is sort of contradictory in some sense. And I mean, if you read that chapter, chapter 5, where Victor Frankenstein has finally, you know, he's ready to reanimate his creation, he's ready to reanimate the corpse. He's been working on this for 2 years, but his reaction is sort of contradictory. On the one hand, Mary Shelley explains in the novel how Victor, you know, the brilliant scientist that he is, has spent the better part of 2 years obsessively devoted to his project, kind of like a PhD student. You know, Victor's been obsessed with creating life and with reanimating a corpse. So he's obsessed. That's the only thing he's been doing for 2 years, basically. He's isolated himself from society and from anyone else to complete his work. On the other hand, Shelley says in the book, Frankenstein himself eventually becomes horrified and disgusted when the creature is reanimated, right? Frankenstein recoils in horror and flees the scene. So what is going on here? Well, in the novel, Victor Frankenstein tells us that the corpse he has worked on is kind of sutured. You know, it's composed of different limbs, different body parts. It's not just one corpse. He's gathered the most beautiful limbs to kind of create the most beautiful specimen, right? So it's not as if Victor has just gone and you know, yanked some dead person off a trolley and reanimated this dead person. He is carefully, obsessively selected each individual body part to represent, you know, this kind of perfect being that he wants to create. And so he describes these individual body parts, these individual limbs as, and this is a quote, he says they're beautiful. You know, this is a quotation from Victor. So he says, these fine selection of limbs are beautiful. This is the word he describes. However, the corpse as a totality is met with disgust from Victor when it is imbued with life. So on the one hand, the particular individual limbs are designated as beautiful, but the corpse as a complete work is only deemed horrific and disgusting and ugly once it is imbued with life, once it is reanimated. So so this is a quote from Victor in the book. So he says, quote, "Now that I've finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, the breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the thing I had created, I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep." End quote. So essentially what happens here is that Victor finally completes the project that he's been working on obsessively for 2 years. He's finished, he's completed it. However, once the creature, you know, is reanimated, once the creature is alive, Victor is horrified. He recoils in disgust and runs away. And the question for this presentation, and the question for me, and hopefully the question for all of you, is why does Victor run away? Why does he recoil in horror? What is he running from? In what sense is the reanimation scene in the story horrific? And furthermore, what is the source of the horror? What is the origin of the horror? Because I think this is an open question. It's not very clear. Okay, so how are we to understand this sudden shift in Victor's disposition from the idealized beauty to material disgust? To the reader of the novel, Victor Frankenstein's behavior cannot but appear as slightly strange and confusing if you really think about what Victor or how Victor is reacting. Are we, as readers of the book or as listeners to the story, are we really to believe that the genius Victor Frankenstein only became aware or only recognized the monstrosity of his creation only after its completion? So for 2 years, he was selecting limbs individually, you know, sewing limbs onto a corpse, and he was blinded to the monstrosity of his work. Is this really what's going on? I don't think so, right? I think it would be somewhat superficial, actually, and all too quick to argue that the reanimation scene represents the death of the that represents the death of idealized dreams and aspirations. That Frankenstein's fantasy of playing God is somehow squashed by the material reality of his work. Now, within the world of the text, within the world of the story that Shelley is telling, there is, of course, a very simple and psychological explanation for Victor's behavior, right? Victor's obsession with his work, his desire to be seen as a great genius, as a great creator, and a father of a new species, his obsession has blinded him to the truly horrific nature of his endeavors. Victor is a man in denial, and his denial is so strong, it is so palpable that it literally blinded him to what he was in fact doing. He couldn't see what he was doing, if we can think about it this way. And the denial is only really shattered once the creature is brought to life. So that's one explanation, right? So this is one of, I mean, you can think of this as kind of more of a psychological or character study driven explanation for Victor's reaction in this chapter. Okay, that seems perfectly plausible and perfectly reasonable and in some sense believable, right? And on some level, this is true, I think. Okay, on some superficial level, that's all well and good. However, I don't think it entirely explains the nature of the horror in the reanimation scene. Because what this explanation is really, what this explanation hinges on, I think, is the transition from lifeless corpse to a living and breathing reanimated individual. And the idea in this explanation is, well, okay, Victor was in denial, he couldn't see what he was doing, and it's only when the corpse is imbued with life that he's horrified, right? So in a sense, life is made to be the source of the dread and disgust, right? So Victor's only disgusted when the dead corpse is living in some sense. So is this a plausible explanation? Does this satisfy this question? I'm not entirely sure of this, right? So is it the life thing? Maybe. Or is the source of the horror the creature's physical appearance? Now, on a textual level, yes, Shelley does describe the monster's or the creature's skin as being yellow and decayed and, ugly. But remember, Victor worked on this project for 2 years. So he was confronting the physical appearance of the creature on a daily basis. And remember, Victor described the individual limbs as beautiful, not disgusting or not ugly. So it is only when he has finished, creating the creature. So on this explanation, the first explanation was, okay, he's in denial, and the denial is shattered only when we transition from lifelessness to life. And my question now is, well, that doesn't really hold up. So what if the horror is the physical appearance of the monster? Well, that doesn't really hold up either, I think, because first of all, Victor describes the limbs as beautiful, and he only really recoils again when the monster is animated. So it doesn't really make sense for the horror to be the physical appearance of the monster alone, because Victor saw the monster, or at least saw the dead corpse on a daily basis for 2 years or so. So the physical appearance alone can't really be a satisfactory explanation, at least to me. Maybe you disagree. So to drive the point home, Victor's only shocked and horrified when the creature is reanimated with the full force of life. And yet the transition from the dead to the undead, because remember, the creature is technically not alive, but undead, is not really a persuasive explanation either as to why this scene is so horrific, or it's not an explanation as to why Victor reacts the way he does. So I personally don't really find any of these explanations that satisfying, right? Because for me, they don't really adequately capture the horrific nature of what's going on here. All of these explanations fall short. And so what I'm trying to propose here is that there's maybe something a bit more complex going on. So why is Frankenstein's creature so unbearable and so disgusting to Victor Frankenstein. What makes the monster so monstrous? This is essentially the question, right? Remember, the monster hasn't done anything yet. The monster hasn't killed anyone, hasn't spoken. The monster is just kind of, you know, been turned on, as it were, imbued with life. And Victor is terrified and disgusted and flees from the room. So, you know, the monstrosity of the monster isn't anything he's done yet. It's just the fact that he's been, you know, in a sense, you know, he's finally a living thing. So, could it be that it's his appearance, like we said before? Well, maybe. But I think if you look at what Shelley actually says in the text, this might be a bit helpful. But it's helpful in the sense that Shelley really doesn't say much about the physical description of the creature, right? She mentions kind of yellow eyes and kind of ugly yellow skin, but what's lacking about the passages that Shelley has in describing the monster in the reanimation scene are that her descriptions are very short. There's a brevity to them. And in fact, there's a lack of description of the monster's appearance. We get maybe a few phrases here and there. So if the monstrosity is really with if the monstrosity of the creature is grounded in the monster's appearance, Shelley's actual description of the monster in the book doesn't really do that justice either. She doesn't really say much about the monster's appearance. We know that Victor Frankenstein is conveying his tale to another character named Walton. And this is the first encounter with the monster that we have in Shelley's novel. However, the language Shelley uses does not adequately capture the horrific element of the creature either. So I want to suggest that the lack of description here is not entirely accidental. That is to say, it's not that, oh, Shelley was a young writer, she didn't know any better, it's an amateur work of fiction. I'm not going to go in that direction. I don't think it's productive. My argument is that the lack of description is actually part of the complexity here. So it's not that Shelley fails as an author. However, it's that at the level of language, the reason language fails to adequately grasp and capture the unbearable appearance of the monster should make us pause and think, I think. This lack, this linguistic lack, can be thought of as a negative determination, to use Hegelian jargon, in the sense that it demonstrates, I think, the shortcomings of having a representational image of the sort of horror that Shelley had in mind when she was thinking, creating the monster. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, language cannot do the monster justice because the monster defies language. Does the monster defy language? But what I'm going to be arguing here is that the monster defies categorization, both on an ontological level and on an epistemological level. And so it is here that I think Immanuel Kant's notion of the sublime, of the dynamical sublime in his aesthetics, can be helpful. As you may know, for Kant, the sublime refers to a phenomena, either in nature or in art, that surpasses or goes beyond the faculty of our understanding. It in a sense, it goes beyond our senses. It overwhelms us. And so on a strictly representational level, then, Frankenstein's creature certainly has an element of the sublime. However, Kant still maintains that the feeling of the sublime resides within the rational finite subject and not in the phenomenal object. So Kant argues, yes, you know, when we confront the sublime object, it goes beyond our abilities to cognize it. You know, it's kind of overwhelming. But for Kant, this resides in the rational subject, not in the object at all. So this is where my interpretation diverges from Kant's theory of the sublime, because I'm not claiming that the monster it's only at the level of Victor's own psyche. So I'm not doing a kind of reductive psychological explanation here, right? So just to make this clear, I think Kant's notion of the sublime can be helpful, because I think what it does is it allows us to think of phenomena that go beyond our rational capacities. So that's the element of it that I find interesting. But I'm not in agreement with the rest of what Kant says, which is this resides in the subject. Because if we take, basically, if we give a purely Kantian interpretation here, then the source of horror is Victor Frankenstein's own faculties, right? It becomes kind of a subjectivist argument, and that's kind of boring and played out and not very interesting. So I reject that last bit of Kant, if that makes any sense. So I'm not claiming that the source of the horror is within Victor himself. But the sublime here is helpful, and I think so. What I'll be doing now is connecting the Kantian sublime to a more Bedouin account. So the reanimation scene then is sublime in some sense, because, like I've said, it pushes beyond the knowing subject's sensuous capabilities. So in the novel, in this chapter, not only does Victor Frankenstein's own senses fail at this moment, that is the moment when the monster is reanimated, but language also fails. In the reanimation scene, language brushes up against its own limit, a limit that is ontological as much as it is phenomenological and linguistic. So when I say here that language fails, I mean this on a metatextual level. So Shelley's own language fails, right? She describes the monster as, being sewn together by limbs and yellow skin and, yellow eyes and so on. But she's not able, I think, to capture the true Gothic horrific nature of what she's trying to describe. So in a sense, Shelley fails, but not because she's an inadequate author or any of that nonsense, but because linguistics as a discipline fails, I think. It has to fail. There's no way to describe the horror. The minute you can describe it, you lose the horror, essentially. Or to put it dialectically, the phenomenological limitation of language belies the ontological status, or rather the non-status of the monster. So not only does language fail at doing the monstrosity of the monster justice at a textual level, Shelley's lack of descriptions, but this is where all cinematic and let me say theatrical adaptations and productions of Frankenstein's book also fail, right? If you've ever seen any film, any Frankenstein film, either the famous Boris Karloff film or the one with Robert De Niro or anything in between, all of these depictions fail to capture the horror, right? Because the horror isn't, and this is kind of my argument, right? That the horror, whatever the source of the horror is, it is not something that can be captured and represented, either cinematically or theatrically, or visually even, or through the use of language, through the use of any kind of medium. So this is why I think, and Corey and I gave a talk about this maybe 2 years ago, where I talked more about Blade Runner, but this is why I think that Blade Runner is perhaps philosophically the best and the most accurate adaptation of Shelley's novel. So although Blade Runner is of course not really about Frankenstein at all, the fact that it's not about Frankenstein, it's based on Philip K. Dick's novel, of course, but the fact that it's not directly about Frankenstein makes it a more accurate, at least philosophically, a more accurate adaptation of what the novel is trying to do in this chapter. And that's because Blade Runner as a film doesn't try to represent, visually Frankenstein's monster directly, but it is rather Frankenstein's spiritual higher, right? Or spiritual offspring, rather than a direct adaptation of the book itself. We can get back to Blade Runner in the discussion if people have questions. Because Blade Runner and science fiction and all of this stuff, you know, they owe a lot to Mary Shelley, of course. Okay, so Victor Frankenstein. So back to the reanimation scene. So, okay, so what I'm saying is here basically that if we think about the monster as a sublime object or a sublime event, we can partly explain how Victor Frankenstein's senses and cognitive capacities fail to cognize the creature. And that's why kind of he recoils, because he can't, you know, he doesn't know how to think about this being, right? And there's some textual evidence for this in the novel itself. So Victor Frankenstein cannot maintain any kind of prolonged exposure to the creature. That is, he can't endure being around the creature. And yet, and he kind of says this as much. He says, quote, that he can't, so Victor says something like that he can't endure, quote, the aspect of the being, end quote, which he has created. So Shelley uses these words, aspect of the being which Victor has created. So Victor's inability to endure the very existence, the being of the creature itself, suggests, I think, that on a phenomenological level, at least, there is something essentially explosive and overwhelming about the monster's very existence. And following that, its being in the world, it's I mean, of course, its appearance, but also the fact that it isn't now a thing in the world, right? So what I'm essentially arguing here is that Frankenstein's horror at his creation is a very existential horror. It is a very ontological kind of horror. It's not simply a phenomenological or a representational horror, right? It's much deeper. So the absolute dread that fills Victor Frankenstein is in some sense, I think, caused by the monster's very being. The monster's very existence resists any ontological category. Remember, the monster is neither alive nor dead, but it is undead. And I'll get to this in a second. So at this point, I think it's helpful if you refer to Badiou. So very quickly, in Being an Event, Badiou constructs the necessary conceptual tools, which I think allow us to interpret the reanimation scene in the book as what he calls an event. Events for Badiou intervene into an existing situation that fundamentally disrupt and thereby reinscribe the prevailing epistemology at work in that situation. Events for Badiou are necessarily undecidables, because from the standpoint of the situation, the event cannot be determined to belong to it. This undecidability is what characterizes the event for Badiou. And so we've seen that within the world of the novel, right, Victor Frankenstein's creature can be thought of, I think, as being an undecidable being. That is, he is neither alive nor dead, like I just said, he is undead. But the word undead, so you may say, okay, well, wait a minute. If we're going along with Badiou here, and you're saying that Badiou's, you know, the event is something that eludes all epistemology, then how come we can describe the creature as being undead? We're using a word, right, undead. So isn't your interpretation, you know, doesn't this undermine your argument? Well, not necessarily, right? Because of course, what Badiou points out is that we have to invent a word to, you know, we have to nominate a designation that we assign to the event. We have to, in a sense, decide on the undecidable, right? So in keeping with Badiou's logic, the word undead describes the creature perfectly, because the creature is neither alive nor dead, but it's both somehow. It is a living corpse, right? The creature is a walking contradiction. So we have to invent a word, or you know, we have to create new jargon to refer to events for Badiou. And I think that is consistent with what I'm saying here in relation to the monster and the word undead. So in Badiou's terminology, the reanimation scene can be interpreted as an event in the sense that it defies the prevailing epistemology and it defies categorization. For Badiou, being itself prohibits the event. That is to say, an event cannot be categorized with any established ontological framework. And it is for this reason that, as Badiou says, quote, ontology has nothing to say about the event, end quote. The monster, in Shelley's novel and the story, the monster ought not to exist, but nevertheless, it does exist. And therefore, its undead existence is ontologically explosive and disruptive. Our ontological and epistemological categories do not apply to the monster because it eludes them by virtue of existing. The monster cannot be counted as one, that is to say, included within the existing ontological framework, because it subverts that very framework, right? It is a living dead thing. It is a contradictory entity. So the reanimation scene in the novel doesn't just have ontological significance, but it also aligns nicely, I think, with Badiou's further thesis that the event punches a hole in knowledge, right? So Badiou argues that events are disruptive, so they rupture any kind of prevailing epistemology. That's why we have to create new terms and new vocabulary to kind of describe the event, right? So Victor Frankenstein's horror is a result of the reanimated monster's ontological disturbance. Victor is terrified at his creation because he cannot comprehend it. And he can't comprehend it because his existing epistemology, the existing framework that he understands the world, cannot discern the ontological status of the monster itself. In this precise sense, the monster and the monster's existence defies Frankenstein's ability to know. The creature is, to borrow a phrase from Jacques Rancière, the part of no part. In this sense, in this sense, the monster can be said to be phenomenologically liminal or disorienting. It is an ontological abomination. And the creature is, of course, absent from all epistemology. And it is for this, and well, it is for all of these reasons, I think, the reanimation scene makes sense, at least a bit, because we've kind of rejected the kind of psychological character study explanation. We have rejected, the idea that the horror hinges on life, because that seems a bit dubious and inadequate. So the one that I'm proposing is a more Badiouian ontological explanation for the source of the horror. So this is near the end, don't worry. So if the Badiouian event is not constitutive of ontology, then where does it come from? Well, as you may know, as Badiou argues, events for him expose what he calls the void. And the void is that which is unpresentable within ontological discourse, but nevertheless functions as ontology's non-ground or abyssal ground. So the word abyss, as you probably may know, comes from the Greek word abyssos. I'm probably mispronouncing that. But the Greek word has two meanings, as far as I can tell. One, as an adjective, it means bottomless, boundless, but also the unfathomable. And its second meaning is as a noun. So the abyss as a bottomless pit or primeval chaos. So without going into too much detail into Badiou's work, I think it is just important to note that the void does not have any ontological status. It does not exist, or rather it non-exists. The void is, to use Badiou's, and so Badiou borrows from set theory, right? So the void is what Badiou also says set theory describes as the null set, right? The void, the null set. It is an operational concept for Badiou. So while Badiou does not emphasize this existential aspect of the void in his work, he does point out that, and this is a quote from Badiou, so he points out that for the void to become localizable at the level of presentation, a dysfunction of the count is required, which results from an excess of one. The event will be this ultra one of a hazard on the basis of which the void of a situation is retroactively discernible, end quote. So the void only becomes discernible for Badiou in the wake of an event. So events erupt and expose the voidal abyss at the heart of being. And so here we find an almost proto-Lovecraftian cosmic horror to all of this, right? In the sense that we're now thinking about the reanimation scene in Shelley's Frankenstein, and we're reading it through Badiou's notion of the void and the event. And I think this allows us to see how the monster, the creature, that which is neither alive nor dead, but undead, exposes the non-being or the voided foundation of all reality. It's like a torsion in being, at least this is how I'm thinking about it. So to conclude, so back to our question, right? Why is Victor Frankenstein so horrified at his creation only after the monster is given life? My proposed answer or interpretation is that the cause of horror, the source, comes from the void. Or to say the same thing another way, Victor Frankenstein is filled with existential dread at the sight of the creature because, for a split second at least, he witnessed the empty void, the abyssal nothingness on which all of reality itself rests or turns. So it might be helpful here to think of Jean-Paul Sartre's example of the drain hole from being a nothingness, where, Sartre says something like, the world has a kind of drain hole in the middle of its being, that it is perpetually flowing off through this hole. And so in the same way, in the novel, the creature, at least this is the argument of my presentation, right, can be thought of as embodying and even personifying the drain hole of the world, letting all of reality flow through it into the empty void at the core of being. Happy Halloween.
Brilliant, thank you, Borna. Great uplifting note to end on. And it can be uplifting in a certain kind of way. So now, there's so much that I'm sure everybody wants to get stuck into, but I will hand over to Corey for now.
Okay, thanks Sabine, thanks Epina and the other organizers for an object, for inviting us to give this sort of pre-Halloween talk on Frankenstein. I'm going to sort of change registers a bit, whereas Borna was focused on the ontological and the epistemological dimension. I'm going to focus on primarily a few political readings of the text. Borna mentioned just a little bit of background to our work on Frankenstein. Borna mentioned that we've been collaborating off and on Frankenstein, thinking about Frankenstein for a few years now. He mentioned the presentation that we gave a couple years ago, and we've also collaborated on a book chapter. I promised the editor that I'd put a plug in for the book. So Creolizing Frankenstein, where our chapter Misinterpolated Monsters is going to appear, that book should be out sometime next year. So if you're interested in reading more sorts of interpretations like the ones that we're offering here, check out Creolizing Frankenstein, Rowman and Littlefield, hopefully 2021. So Frankenstein is one of these texts that turns out to be, to prompt a profusion of interpretations. It is a text that leads us to interpret it and reinterpret it. Some have said that this is what distinguishes works of literary art or other forms of art from things that aren't artistic. So for example, Alexander Nehamas says the reason or the difference between two superficially similar novels like Moby Dick and Jaws, right? They're both fish stories, but what differentiates them and what makes one of them art and the other a sort of a pulp novel or a genre novel is that we keep coming back to Moby Dick in a way that we don't necessarily do for Jaws, right? So that it prompts a profusion of interpretations. It invites us to interpret and reinterpret it. And so I start with that sort of aesthetic note to lead into what I'm going to present, which is actually 3 different political readings of the text. My aesthetic note is sort of a disclaimer. This is by no means an exhaustive enumeration of the political interpretations of the text, right? There are a whole host of other ways that you can interpret the text, and there are a whole host of other political ways that you can interpret the text. So I'm going to present what I think are for me at least, and for Borna and I, because these are the sorts of political interpretations that we've been focused on. These are the salient interpretations for us. So I've got a conservative interpretation that I want to begin with, and then I want to proceed to give 2 radical interpretations of the novel. The radical interpretations that I'll be presenting are a couple of different, slightly different variations on a Marxist theme, and then a decolonial theme. Should also preface this by saying, when I get to the radical interpretations, I'm only distinguishing them analytically, right? It's sort of a heuristic device to make this distinction between a class-based political interpretation of the novel versus a race and decolonial interpretation of the novel. I think if we really want to understand what's going on here, we have to think of these together, but I'm going to separate them for the purposes of this presentation. All right, so the conservative interpretation. I want to start with this because I think it's a really common and popular interpretation of the novel. And I don't think it's a bad interpretation of the novel. I think it's got it's interesting, and it's definitely there in the novel, right? So this conservative interpretation, the reason I call it the conservative interpretation is because of 2 features of these sorts of interpretations. First, the conservative interpretation, or the conservative interpretation that I'm interested in, focuses on the figure of Victor Frankenstein and sees the monster as just sort of a plot device or a creature that simply depended upon Victor Frankenstein, but where the action is in the novel, according to this conservative interpretation, is on Victor, right? The figure of Victor, who Victor is, and what's motivating him. And that means that within the context of this conservative interpretation, the only thing that the monster can do is react against Victor. The only way he can conceive of acting is by reacting against Victor, begging Victor to create a mate for him, trying to kill everyone that Victor loves. This reactive dimension of the monster, this dependent dimension of the monster, is a feature of this conservative interpretation. Again, it's not, people who read the novel in this way aren't imagining things. It's there, it's important. And so what kind of a person is Victor according to this conservative interpretation? One way that this conservative interpretation plays out is by seeing Victor as a figure who secularizes a very Christian account of the limits of knowledge. And so what Victor has done wrong is tried to learn and know things that humans shouldn't know. So it becomes a secular moral version of a Christian story that's quite old. Going back to, you can find biblical sources for it. You can find sources in St. Augustine in his Confessions, right? So I just want to draw on Augustine for a moment on Curiosity, Confessions, book 10. So what Augustine is doing here is thinking about the difference in how the senses relate to objects of pleasure versus how the senses relate to objects of curiosity. And he writes, pleasure pursues beautiful objects, what's agreeable to look at, to hear, to smell, to taste, to touch. But curiosity pursues the contraries of these delights with the motive of seeing what the experiences are like, not with a wish to undergo discomfort, but out of a lust for experimenting and knowing, end quote. So, whereas we pursue pleasurable objects that are pleasurable to the senses because we find them beautiful and attractive, we might look at things that are, or pursue things that are disgusting, right, or ugly, out of a sense of curiosity. What Augustine subsequently will call a lust for experimenting and knowing. And so it's this lust for experimenting and knowing that seizes Victor. So what Victor has done wrong is given into this lust for experimenting and knowing. Now, in the sort of romantic framework, right, the framework of British Romanticism and the Gothic that Mary Shelley's writing in, right, this Christian framework for thinking about the lust for experimenting and knowing has become thoroughly secularized, right? And so we're made to think that what Victor has done, his transgressive move, is immoral, right? But not necessarily, or not sinful at all, right? So the idiom has changed, right? We've made the transition from a religious, specifically a Christian idiom for thinking about the lust of experimenting and knowing, to a more secular, moral idiom, right? This is wrong, this is immoral, and Victor, and furthermore, everyone that Victor knows and loves are going to have to pay a price for his moral mistakes. So in other words, Victor, in performing these experiments, in reanimating the dead, has transgressed natural limits and done something which we shouldn't do. In the older pre-modern Christian context, it's God that imposes these limits. In the modern context that Mary Shelley's working in, one of the questions here that the novel raises is, how do we understand Victor's transgression in this new secularized moral context, right? If it's not that God's going to punish us, right? Where does the punishment? Who's the agent that that makes sure that Victor's transgression is punished? And so I just want to conclude then the conservative interpretation that focuses on the figure of Victor and Victor's moral transgression disregards the figure of the monster, sees the monster as just sort of a plot device, a means for us to better understand what Victor's up to and who Victor is. By citing literary critic Roger Shattuck's discussion of Frankenstein, so in a book called Forbidden Knowledge, Shattuck discusses Frankenstein and Goethe's Faust together. And so as you listen to the summary, think about how Shattuck's sort of presupposing this secularized version of Victor's curiosity. So this is Shattuck, quote, "The incidents of Shelley's novel build inexorably toward the climax of intellectual ambition unmasked. It provides her grand finale. The all too human monster, who's tried earnestly, though implausibly, to socialize and educate himself, commits 4 horrible murders among those Frankenstein loves most. The action devolves into a grotesque contest in madness, self-glorification, and self-immolation. The dying Frankenstein shows great agitation as he speaks to Walton, the fanatic explorer who's trying to rescue him. Farewell, Walton. Seek happiness and tranquility and avoid ambition, even if it be only the apparently innocent one of distinguishing yourself in science and discoveries. Yet why do I say this? I have myself been blasted in these hopes, yet another may succeed. So that's from chapter 24 of the novel. Shattuck concludes, even in death, Dr. Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus, cannot lay aside the ambitious drives that have devastated his life. So in this first reading, or the first reading that I'm discussing here, we see Frankenstein as basically a morality tale in which the ambitious scientist gives life to dead flesh, something of a scientific miracle, and thereby gives birth to a monster. And this is where Borna's analysis sort of begins. All right, so I want to move from this conservative interpretation that focuses on the monster, or focuses on Victor's, the character, the figure of Victor and his moral transgressions, right? His epistemological transgressions, his curiosity, and think about two radical interpretations. The difference then between what I'm calling the conservative interpretation or conservative interpretations and the radical interpretations is that the focus shifts from thinking about Victor and what's going on with Victor and Victor's transgressions, how he's transgressed the order of nature and created something monstrous, to focusing on the figure of the monster and thinking about whether there are moments in the monster, moments in the novel where the monster might give rise to other possibilities beyond this sort of destructive interplay between Victor and the monster that ends in their mutual destruction. So then, just to reiterate, these revolutionary and decolonial readings, which I'm distinguishing for the purposes of this presentation, but we should think together, these revolutionary and decolonial readings, these Marxist readings and these decolonial readings, they think about what the monster represents, right? Now, this might be problematic. It might be something that Borna and I want to talk more about, right? What is the monster? What is the figure of the monster? And is this metaphorical reading, this figurative reading of the monster, is it possible within the Baudelaire context that Borna just finished presenting? So we have the revolutionary and the decolonial readings that focus on the monster as a figure of the proletarian masses. We can see this in a classic essay by Warren Montague. Montague wants to read Frankenstein, the novel, as a revolutionary text. And here I'm drawing on an excerpt from that book chapter that Borna and I have written that I mentioned previously. So Warren Montague argues that the French Revolution is present in the work, albeit indirectly. Although the novel never mentions the French Revolution, it does take place during the time of the French Revolution. Montague notes that the novel was published in 1818, just a few years after Napoleon's final defeat in 1815 brought the revolutionary era to a close. The narrative of Frankenstein is framed by a series of letters between Captain Walton, who finds Victor Frankenstein, a series of letters between Captain Walton and his sister. Walton finds Victor near death, having chased his monstrous creation to the northern wastes above the Arctic Circle. So the story of Frankenstein is actually the tale that Victor tells Walton as Victor's convalescing aboard Walton's vessel. And Walton in turn relays this story to his sister. So the narrative structure of the novel is quite complex. We have stories within stories. We have the monster's story that's relayed by Victor to Walton, that Walton in turn writes down and sends to his sister. These letters that Walton writes to his sister omit the exact year in which they were written, with a date given at 17 .. But Montague locates a passage within the novel that dates the events of the novel in the 1790s sometime. The reference is to the earlier English Revolution of 1642, and it's curious because as the only reference to revolution in the text, it actually expresses sympathy for Charles I and these sort of bourgeois revolutions. As Montag notes, quote, its tone is unexpectedly sympathetic to Charles I, a monarch typically regarded by Whigs, that is the moderates of the day, let alone the radicals of Shelley's circle, as the very figure of a tyrant. His absolutist policies, his refusal to base his rule on the consent of Parliament, his abolition of religious freedom were all held to be the causes of the English Civil War that began in 1642 and ended in 1649 when Charles was executed by Parliament. Montag explains Shelley's apparent sympathy for Charles I by pointing out that these so-called bourgeois revolutions of the early modern period were led by the new elites who could only access power by mobilizing the masses against the old regime. Quote from Montag here, but in doing so, they found that they conjured up a monster that once unleashed could not be controlled. It was widely felt even by those sympathetic to such experiments that the mass mobilizations necessary to destroy the old order effectively blocked the creation of the new. So once the dust has settled, the dispossessed find that they've been used to replace one master with another. On Montag's Marxist reading then, the monster represents this dispossessed multitude who remain a problem for the established order despite, or perhaps because, of revolutionary upheaval. By 1815, the promise of the French Revolution had been replaced by what Montag calls a general demoralization that questioned the Enlightenment assumption of progress toward greater freedom through industrialization. The novel's many ambiguities that have one of their sources in the monster's undecidable nature that Borno was talking about, human or not human, alive or dead, and so on, that in turn reflect Shelley's own complex feelings regarding Britain's emerging industrial underclass, feelings recorded in the novel as the feelings of horror and pity that the monster evokes. Right, so that's first Marxist reading of the monster as a figure of revolution, a figure of the dispossessed and the disappointed revolutionary masses. I want to turn briefly now to a second Marxist reading, a second Marxist figuration of the monster. And here I'm drawing on David McNally's Monsters of the Market, where he reads Frankenstein as an anti-capitalist text. Now, this is slightly different, right? So whereas Montag's interested in the possibilities and the disappointments of revolution as they're felt by the masses and how this is represented by the monster, McNally wants to read the monster as a figure for the masses as they are subject to industrial capital at the beginning of the 19th century. So McNally wants to claim that the novel, or the question at the heart of the novel is, given that we're all creatures of the market, creatures of capitalism, and the question that the novel raises is, are we going to let ourselves be controlled by the market? Or are we going to resist? And if we're going to resist, then how are we going to do so? So McNally argues that this is the question at the heart of Frankenstein. And so Montag and McNally are sort of in agreement here. But what McNally focuses on in his reading of the novel are various anxieties of early industrial capitalism. And he points out that these anxieties focus on the question of corpses, and specifically whether medical science has a right to the bodies of both the poor and the executed criminals. Right? So these anxieties are very much, these anxieties around the status of corpses, what's going to happen to our bodies after we die, what's going to happen to the bodies of our loved ones after we die, is very much part of the context of Mary Shelley's novel. Because remember, of course, what Victor does is steal body parts, right, over a period of time from cemeteries, from graveyards, and reassemble them and eventually reanimates them. So McNally, in his account, cites various 18th century accounts of condemned men. So there's a quote from Monsters of the Market. Awaiting death by hanging in 1737, Henry Bossuet, a sawyer, implored a workmate to, quote, save my body from the surgeons. Sentenced to death 2 years later for theft, Richard Tobin, a drawer, entreated his former master into consideration my poor body by ensuring that it should be saved from the surgeons. Family members and friends often needed no such prompting, regularly assuring loved ones awaiting the gallows that we shall take care of your body. As Peter Lambaugh has brilliantly shown, saving the bodies of the condemned from dissection was a central aspect of a working class culture of solidarity against the law and the authorities. To this end, the laboring poor created two unique forms of working class cooperation in the face of death: the friendly societies to which workers contributed pennies to fund a proper burial, and the riot against the surgeons at the gallows. And so McNally also sees the French Revolution as an important context, but he also draws upon discourse around Ireland and Irish insurrection as an important context for the novel. So both Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley and her father, William Godwin, they were ardent defenders of the French Revolution and freedom, as well as freedom for Ireland. The Irish had long been portrayed as subhuman monsters. McNally writes that, quote, the Irish were rebel monsters in every sense. At home, they plotted insurrection, never more dangerously than in 1798, when the United Irishmen made common cause with revolutionary France in its war with Britain. So in other words, the context of the French Revolution is significant, but the context of Irish insurrection and the dangers that the Irish pose to Britain are also in the background here. So we've got, in addition to the context of more than one revolutionary movement, we've got the anxiety over body snatchers and surgeons who are going to dissect your corpse after you've died, right, without your permission. McNally cites one further movement that was active at the beginning of the 19th century for understanding the radical political context of Frankenstein, and that's Luddism. So active again in the years 1811 to 1817, that is right before the novel was published, when Mary Shelley was writing it. The Luddites mounted a decentralized movement against industrial capitalism, especially in the woolen industry, with 1812 riots in cities such as Manchester, Coventry, Birmingham, and Sheffield. And so what McNally does is sort of flesh out Montag's revolutionary reading, or reading of the monster in terms of the revolutionary masses, and think about these various mass movements that provide contexts and that are certainly present, if only indirectly, within the novel. So now what I want to do is turn to one final radical interpretation. And this is what I'm calling the decolonial reading. We also have versions of the decolonial reading in our forthcoming book chapter. So what's the difference then between the Marxist and the decolonial reading? Right? Both of them are going to focus on the monster. Both of them are going to see the monster as a figure for something or someone, whether it's a social movement or the dispossessed masses. But whereas the Marxist readings focus on a class-based analysis of the novel, seeing the novel as a figure of the proletariat, right? As a stand-in for Irish insurrection or French revolutionary fervor, or the Luddites' riots against industrial capital. decolonial readings begin with the assumption of the monster as a racialized figure. And so we think back, for example, to that, that creation scene that Borna analyzed so well. Notice that the monster is described, right, albeit in spare terms, minimalistically. The monster is described as having yellow skin and yellow eyes and jet black hair. And so interpreters, and perhaps Mary Shelley herself, right, took this to be a racialized description. That the monster didn't read as white. And so based on that reading, right, decolonial readings can see the monster as a figure standing in for representing the wretched, or in a more literal translation of Fanon's text, the wretched of the earth, the damned of the earth. And so if we begin with that assumption, that the monster is in some sense or reads as a racialized figure, then we can begin to read the novel in terms of how the monster is dehumanized. And so on that reading, on this decolonial reading, the source of Victor's initial horror, when his pleasure turns to horror at the contemplation of what he's created, one of the sources for that horror is that he's created not a beautiful specimen of humanity, but a figure of dehumanized monstrosity. And despite Victor's despite the monster's best attempts to overcome this dehumanization, to overcome this designation, right, this reaction to him as a monster, by learning to read and write, by trying to become human, by desperately trying to be recognized as human, right? The novel shows us that these hopes are futile, that they won't be realized. Another way of thinking about the racialized dimension of the monster is provided by Elizabeth Young in her work, Black Frankenstein, 2009. She's interested in how racial discourse in the United States, as a figure first tied to slave revolts, right? So the monster, the connection between the monster and Nat Turner's revolt in 1831, other slave revolts. Right? Summarizing the scope of her literary and cultural studies approach, she writes, writing in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War, Frederick Douglass declared, "Slavery is everywhere the pet monster of the American." In the midst of the Second Civil War, launched by the Civil Rights Movement, of that pet monster. When he saw James Wales's Frankenstein as a child, Gregory remembered, he realized that, quote, from Dick Gregory now, here was a monster created by a white man, turning upon his creator. The horror movie was merely a parable of life in the ghetto. The monstrous life of the ghetto has been created by the white man. Only now in the city of chaos are we seeing the monster created by oppression turn upon its creator. One of the things that we do in our book chapter is think about this discourse of monstrosity, the figure of the monster, in terms of Amy Césaire's discourse on colonialism, where he diagnoses the colonized condition as in terms of what he calls thingification. So this is Césaire now. Of course, there are various ways that we relate to things, but we typically treat natural things with indifference, unless they threaten us and are deemed dangerous. Things that we've made are often treated as conveniences. They make our lives more bearable or more comfortable or easier. Each of these attitudes toward things has been characteristic at one time or another of the ways that the colonized have been treated by the colonizer. Treated as objects of indifference, as objects of danger, as objects of convenience, but never as human. These attitudes toward things have also determined the ways that the colonizer relates to the colonized. This is a sketch. So here, back to our paper. This is a sketch of what Césaire's equation means and how the projection of colonization is fundamentally a project of dehumanization in the name of economic development. So Césaire claims that the state of the colonized is one of living death, that the colonized are literally undead. On Césaire's account then, and Fanon picks up on this, the decolonial struggle is similar to the monsters. It's an effort to become part of the community of the living. It's an effort to transform one's dehumanized state into one of humanity. So drawing on Frantz Fanon, Lewis Gordon claims that Black identity is a creation of the white world, right? So this dynamic of creator and creature, creator and creation is a dynamic that that helps us to make sense of racial hierarchies that exist in modernity. And so this Black identity as a creation of the white world is relatively recent. So one possibility open to Black people and people of color on Gordon's account in this dynamic, right, creator and creature, is to attempt to become white. Gordon sees this first option as analogous to the monster's efforts to educate himself so that he might be recognized as human. But Gordon sees this first option, the option of becoming white, the option of educating yourself so that you're recognized as human by those in power, as a narcissistic dynamic that's doomed to failure. Here's Gordon, quote, "Similar to Shelley's creature, Fanon's Black embarks on a journey born of rejection through successive paths of failures. There's the failure of public appearance despite mastery of cultural resources such as language, erotic recognition marked by an effort to find a mate or the sanctuary of love fails. Retreat into the life of dreams offers nightmarish reminders of reality. Even defiance through affirmed negations such as negritude, valorized Blackness, culminates in sorrow and tears. Without hope, the location of abnormality, monstrosity, raises the problem of being beneath human while reaching for human appearance." So that's the first option, what he terms the narcissistic option, where you try to create yourself in the image of who white people want you to be. So Gordon analyzes this effort to create or recreate oneself or someone in one's own image in terms of narcissism. We can think about how this sort of narcissism operates in so many aspects of our lives today, right? Parents who want their children to be just like them, right? Narcissistic presidents, and so on and so forth. Fanon sees how the political and economic elite in newly independent nations, former colonies, how they became trapped in this narcissistic desire to create a society in the image of the colonizer, rather than engaging in the difficult task of creating society anew. Right? And so we get stuck on Fanon's reading, Lewis Gordon's reading of Fanon. We get trapped in this narcissistic cycle of trying to recreate the world in terms that have already been provided. rather than trying to create something new. So Fanon presents another alternative, a more difficult alternative, right? But one that gets us out of the trap of colonial narcissism. Instead of imitation that's bound to end badly, and instead of being the monster, trying to be like Victor. Those whose identities have been created and imposed by white imperial power must become not imitators, but creators themselves. On this second account, the second possibility, freedom can only be achieved through disobedience. For Fanon, this disobedience takes the form of violence. The old world must be destroyed in order to create the world anew. This is an insight that the monster arguably sees as well. So there's this moment later in the novel where he makes a bargain with Victor, the monster does, and he says he'll go away to South America, never have to see him again, right? Victor will never have to see him again if Victor will animate a mate for him. Victor initially agrees, but breaks his promise. And it's there, that's one of the moments, at least, I think, where we can see this decolonial reading or decolonial readings like this one getting traction, where we can see, okay, here's another possibility. Here's a possibility where the monster offers to break away from this narcissistic dynamic of creator and creature that both Victor and the monster find themselves locked into. Right? But of course, that possibility is going to be violent. It's going to be the terms of its success are uncertain. Right? But it's a new possibility that entails a break with the old. So those are the three sorts of political interpretations that I wanted to present. Hopefully we can talk about these. I'd be happy to talk about many of the other kinds of interpretations that I haven't presented here, right? Psychoanalytic interpretations, feminist interpretations. But I just wanted to give sort of a brief overview and a brief sense of how we might politically interpret the novel and how these various political interpretations, even the conservative one, remain salient. So thank you, and I hope we can have a good discussion.
Thank you so much, Corey. Again, there's so much to think about with all three of those interpretations. You know, it's a really kind of rich topic that obviously yields quite a lot, and I think there was probably a lot more you could have said about the two radical interpretations as well. So I think now what we're going to do is maybe I'll start with a question about your two presentations, and whilst we begin to talk about that, people can start to ask questions in the chat, or maybe say they want to ask a question in the chat, and then I'll come around to them straight afterwards. So to jump right in, how might Borna's Badiouian line of thought be reconciled, Corey, with your three political readings? And how might they maybe form some conceptual alliances, but also how might they conflict? Because Borna's is obviously this ontological or kind of meta-ontological reading, and there are obviously ontological elements of your reading, but it's predominantly more political. So that's open to both of you, obviously. And everybody else, you can start asking or saying that you want to ask a question in the chat.
So my initial thought here, and I think, well, let me just state my initial thought and then I'll sort of complicate that a little bit. My initial thought is that Borna's Badiouian inspired reading of the meta-ontological moment of creation and what that means for the novel is perhaps compatible with the two sorts of radical readings that I proposed, right? Now, what complicates that is that both of the radical readings, both the Marxist reading and the decolonial reading, are seeing the monster as a metaphor, right? Are seeing the monster as a representative of something or someone, right? And so if these two readings are compatible with the Badiouian reading, then they're going to be ways of trying to make sense of the ontological event of the monster, right? So they're going to come after the event. They're an attempt to sort of domesticate the event and try to make sense of
it. I've just seen a comment from Stephen on the side. Hi, Stephen. Who has said, it strikes me that Borner's and Corey's readings are not incompatible, seeing how fidelity to the event in Badiou is related to political revolution, and how the proletariat and the colonized resist representation within the colonizers or ruling classes system. What do you make of that?
I think that sounds great. Yeah, I'm definitely yeah.
I also wonder, I mean, I think that is true, but I also think that it can kind of run into problems, especially when you're thinking necropolitically, in the way that you kind of were with Césaire, and when you're thinking about colonized peoples, or applying it to slavery and so on, where I feel like it's kind of tense to refer to things in terms of negatives or negation or absence, because there's this other tack that you can take that's this kind of like ontologically maximalist, kind of Baroque take of abundance. And when we spoke before, I'd just seen this quote and it seemed really apt, by this artist Ebony Fukuya, who said, a black hole is the result of immense light. Darkness is what holds this universe together, because blackness is not mere absence, but rather an abundance. And obviously they're talking about blackness as in race, but they're also talking about blackness in terms of absence. So for me, it's this kind of tension between absence and presence. I don't want to be like really Derridian and be like, it's all hauntological. Ooh, it's all about absent presence or present absence. But I think there is something about kind of hyper presence, which the creature or the monster represents for me. So something that's kind of technically impossible, almost in a kind of Mayasuian way of hyper chaos. So chaos, but not chaos, this perpetual kind of potential or maybe state, which isn't absence and it isn't presence. And I feel like that kind of underlies those two radical political readings specifically. I don't know if Borner would like come back to that, like, no.
Well, no, I mean, I do agree with you. I think, you know, I mean, so my reading, I mean, what I tried to emphasize was that the Bedouin thing of the event with regards to the creature has to do with how we make sense of it, right? Because of course the monster, the creature exists. You know, it's not a phantasm of Victor's imagination or something, right? And in the story, the you know, the creature is a real thing, as it were. It's not it's not a ghost. It's not a memory or anything like this, although you can probably read it as like a ghost or a memory in some sense. So the question of whether or not it exists is a tricky one, in the sense that, and I mean, you know, Badiou points this out as well, right? That yes, you know, events, you know, he says we can't really predict events, you know, before they happen. We can't anticipate them, right? Because the prevailing discourse of knowledge doesn't lend itself to really predict the event. But after the event happens, or during the event's eruption, we you know, he says something like, during the event's eruption, we can't really necessarily, you know, we have to be loyal to it. We're trying to make sense of it afterwards, right? In retrospect, yes, you know, we create a new language to talk about the event. Politically, of course, you know, the Russian Revolution is an example that he likes, or the French Revolution is an example he likes. So in relation to like my reading and Corey's reading, I think even with my reading, this kind of makes sense, right? Because what I tried to argue was that I'm only interested in that split second or split minute where Victor in the novel recoils in horror, right? Because it is only so if you go back and you read the passage, it's only for a split moment, right? So in terms of so temporally, it's a very short event, if you can think about it this way. And afterwards, you know, in the story, Victor describes the creature as a fiend, as a monster, as a wretched soul, you know. After the fact, okay, you know, Victor has the lexicon to label and dehumanize and damn the creature. But my argument was to try to understand that split moment that Victor recalls in horror. So in terms of whether or not, I mean, we could argue, and I could maybe expand on this reading a little bit and say, well, yes, in that split moment, that's when the void makes itself known. You know, the absent becomes present to Victor, and he kind of recoils. But then afterwards, the monster is, in a sense, something that is cognizable, right? So what I didn't get to do, and maybe I can do this for a different talk sometime or write a paper on it or something, for the rest of the story, for the rest of the novel, the creature is labeled, is named. The creature exists, and Victor creates a term or a label, a lexicon for the monster, right? So in terms of representation, the monster eventually becomes something that is represented through Victor's use of language in the story. So I would think in that sense, I think my reading and Corey's reading kind of line up nicely in some sense. So my issue is only with the reanimation scene itself. And that, you know, as an event that takes maybe a few minutes or whatever in the world of the story, in the world of the novel. But I think it is, you know, it certainly does play on the edge of absence and presence, and I think that's fine. You know, it's I mean, if I were more Deleuzian, I would say that the monster or the creature is kind of a becoming, well, not becoming human, but maybe we can say that the monster or the creature is becoming dash representation, right? And you can fill that, you know, like an empty signifier. You can fill it with all of these political concepts, you know, the damned or the colonized peoples or so on. So you could maybe, this is a Frankenstein pun, you could maybe suture my reading and Corey's reading together to make I don't know, to make a much bigger kind of account of the philosophy at work, of the ideas at work.
I think there are definitely really interesting resonances and things that are kind of adjacent that are just waiting for you both to kind of like sit together and type together. Are you doing that? Are you actually going to write a paper together for this? I know you presented together.
We hadn't talked about doing, well, we talked in vague terms about doing more work on Frankenstein together, but hopefully based on this conversation and the sort of resonances we see between our approaches here today, I think there's definitely more room for that. And we need to, you know, think more concretely about doing more with Frankenstein for sure.
Definitely. I've just seen a question from David that says, I guess my question with Borna's reading is that a soliciting of the void alone doesn't explain Frankenstein's horror. There are many kinds of events in Badiou: scientific events, mathematical events, erotic events, political events, and they all testify to the ungroundedness of being, but they don't inspire horror. It seems to be impossible to bridge the ontological and affective here. That's actually really interesting. I'm just going to jump in really quickly because I was thinking also of the way that Badiou refers to I thought you meant effective, don't worry, David. But I thought it was interesting the way that, you know, Borna, you chose to talk about the Badiouian event, because Badiou does also refer to love, or that moment where, you know, your eyes meet and you fall in love, or the first profound moment of affection also as an event. And then it's really weird the way that actually Badiou kind of refers to it within the context of love. And he refers to it in a really almost Bergsonian way of, in expansion and contraction. So your whole relationship is this expansion and contraction, or systole and diastole, and everything else is just kind of shit and whatever. And you just keep returning to this one event that is kind of like outside of the rest of your relationship, obviously. So I think in a way that does employ a certain level of horror, because you know, like, you'll never have it as good as you had it at the start. So I feel like the horror is, in a way, is always implicit, even with kind of other applications of this idea of the event.
Yeah, and yes, I mean, I think there's something true about, you know, how Betty talks about love, and the, you know, that the relationship may fail, but the love event itself, you know, is forever, and all of these things. And there's I mean, it's an interesting and fascinating part of his philosophy. Thanks, David, for your comment. I think I mean, it's true that Badiou has, you know, famously these 4 conditions, right, of the four conditions of philosophy, and these events, you know, these conditions, you know, are also the fields in which events happen, as you know, for Badiou. That's true. But he's also said there may be more than 4. So, I mean, he doesn't have horror as a kind of event. And Badiou doesn't, I mean, he from what I remember, he has an in aesthetics. He doesn't have an aesthetics as such. That's a different conversation altogether. But if the question to me is, well, what kind of event is this Frankenstein event, you know, the reanimation scene? In terms of Badiou's 4 fields, well, I mean, you could maybe try to argue that it's scientific, but not really, right? Because the scientific community rejects Victor's project on scientific grounds, and okay, moral and ethical grounds as well. So you're right. I don't think what I described fits nicely with Badiou's, say, kind of Badiou's own account in that way, which is fine with me, because I suppose I'm more interested in the ontological or the meta-ontological way that he talks about events in relation to the void and so on. So I suppose I'm not being a good Badiouian. I'm purposefully misreading Badiou or ignoring this part of his philosophy, because I'm more interested in how he thinks about the ungroundedness or the groundlessness of being. So it's that element that I think is horrific, or can be seen as horrific in some way. And of course, Badiou doesn't talk about his ontology in these terms, right? But that's okay, I guess. I mean, yes, I mean, if you ask Badiou what he thought about my presentation, he would probably not agree with it at all. He would say, "What are you doing?" He would reject it. But yes, so I mean, I'm happy with that. I'm happy to diverge from Badiou in this respect. But I guess for me, if I were to take this reading a bit further, I would have to then persuade people how I can nevertheless use Badiou to my own advantage. So it's a challenge for me.
It's kind of nice little disjunctive synthesis you're doing. But it doesn't have to necessarily be universal. That's cool. So I just want to say to everyone also that you can just enable your video and your audio if you like, and just cut in at this point, because we are kind of broadening out and having a chat. So you don't have to write the questions in the chat. Or if you are wanting to wait until somebody's finished talking, you can just say, I have a question, and then afterwards, then you can speak or whatever. So I don't know if anybody has any more questions at the moment that wants to jump in. Okay, don't worry, because I have loads. So you can just cut in while I'm speaking if you like. Think of me more as a kind of background, and your guys' questions can kind of like jump in at opportune moments. And as I said, please do feel free to just enable your audio and jump in. So kind of changing subject here, and thinking in terms of tech and the singularity, because I know that's something that Borna teaches in his syllabus on this topic. There's obviously a resonance with Frankenstein via this kind of technical Prometheanism, where man makes monster that runs out of control is similar to man that makes tech that runs out of control, with both the monster and the tech becoming conscious of themselves, getting something of a subjectivity, or at least something akin to subjectivity, or developing something that some people might call a phenomenal self-model, becoming aware of themselves as a subject. I would suggest personally that we can't with any certainty differentiate where so-called man ends and so-called monster begins, or man ends and tech begins, as there are these kind of ongoing affective affiliations. After all, Frankenstein's monster deems himself as inseparable from his maker. So in the novel, the creature states, "You, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us." And I would go even further, because I also think even if this sort of locus of conjunction, the joining between man and monster, or man and tech, is chronologically in the past, it still exists kind of virtually, it's still real. And so it's still this real bind between man and monster, or man and tech, that persists, which kind of also links to questioning the concept of so-called human subjectivity, which I know, Corey, you were talking about in your presentation as well, with the two radical interpretations. So I guess really my question to you both is whether Victor and the monster are really two sides of the same coin, not just in this sort of psychological interpretation that's often applied, but really ontologically speaking, are they inseparable? And if they are, can we also kind of extend this logic of inseparability to so-called humanity and our technological offspring? And that's a question to everyone if you want to get involved as well.
So my question, I suppose, thinking about the novel, is whether we want to talk about this in terms of sort of a continuity between human subjectivity and technology, or we want to talk about it in a more sort of uncanny way in terms of an indeterminability, right? Is it, so it seems that if we talk about it in terms of continuity, then we might be led to a story of progress where we say, look at, at some point, machines and humans are going to be indistinguishable and we're all going to live in harmony and it's going to be great. But I think what the novel forces us to do, if we take this sort of indeterminacy, whether it's ontological or epistemological or something else, right? And we take the uncanniness of that indeterminacy, right? Of that monstrosity. If we take it seriously, then we might be forced to ask a different question, whether the indistinguishability between human and machine is going to be sort of a potential problem, to put it lightly, for us, right? So if we talk in terms of continuity, I wonder if that's the way that Mary Shelley would want us to talk about it, or would she want us to talk about it in terms of sort of an uncanny indeterminability between man and machine?
That's a really interesting point. I feel like it's both of those things. So somewhere along that kind of continuous, like, chain of becoming or whatever, it becomes some kind of uncanniness takes place, and I mean that's probably you know, more David's kind of topic that we're kind of going into here. So I don't know, David, if you have anything to say on our minor considerations, or anybody else. But yeah, thank you. That was interesting. Yeah, that's a good point. So at this point, doesn't look like anyone else has questions. Okay.
Coming on that,
oh, hi, David.
You yanked my chain there, Sabine. Yeah, I'm sort of I'm not convinced that this kind of cyborgian sort of idea, this sort of idea that we're kind of originally technical, has to eventuate in monstrosity. So I'm not sure if, I mean, obviously in a sense it can, but it seems to be that monstrosity is always very specific. It's or singular. And maybe that's kind of my worry also about the sort of ontological readings of Frankenstein generally. That it's not that it hasn't got an ontological dimension, it's that the effective side, if you like, the generic horror doesn't, in a sense, maybe it kind of testifies to that ontology without, in a sense, being accounted for by it. So I don't know if that makes much sense. I guess the other worry is that if one views ontological change or ontological indeterminacy entirely through the spectacles of horror, that in itself can be a kind of conservative trope, when actually there may be many good reasons for example, cultivating human-machine relationships. You know.
I definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like we're doing now, you know. I mean, we'd be pretty screwed without them at the moment, particularly.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it is kind of a crude reaction for people to, I mean, I know you talk more about this, to jump on this concept of the singularity is it's going to be this thing that ends us all. And it's going to be like wicked, and it's going to be so smart that it's going to concern itself with us. Because I always say to people, like, if it's going to be that smart, is it really going to care? Like that film that I cannot recall, Her, where the girlfriend AI is just like, anyway, I've ascended, see ya. So anyway, I definitely agree with that. I can see another question here from Mehdi to me, which says that I talked about a Deleuzean reading. How would I read the novel according to Deleuze's concept of event in logical sense? I'm going to defer that question for myself because I literally have not given it any thought, even though I am often pushing a flagrantly Deleuzean agenda. But if Borna and Corey have any thoughts of that?
No, I'm gonna bracket. Sorry, I'm gonna bracket that because I would have to go back and read Deleuze, and it's an interesting question, and I'm sure you could give a more Deleuzean reading of the novel, which would be really cool, actually. But I just wanted to kind of go to your question, Sabine, quickly, because I mean, we all know what this theme is about, right? Man versus, humanity versus, will humanity create something that will be its own destruction? And as I've said before, right, our culture, at least our popular culture, is obsessed with this. You know, every other film that gets pumped out of Hollywood is about this, the robots gone mad, or the creature coming back and killing us, but we've created it. And there's variations of this theme, and it's exhausting, really. And it is kind of a really, it of course, in the novel, right, I mean, Shelley really inaugurated this theme for science fiction as a genre, and that's fine. But I think what most people don't really necessarily understand or think about is that this this entire topic is predicated on a notion of what it means to be human, right? We assume that, what it means to be human are these things, and whatever we create, a supercomputer or an AI intelligence or whatever it may be, won't be human because of these traits. And the question is, well, what are those traits? Are they biologically innate? Are they, is it just culturally or socially formed, right? But of course, this is a question about what, human nature. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't necessarily think that there's some innate ontological human nature that makes us all human. We don't have a human essence. I'm not persuaded by that. I never found that convincing. If there's a human nature, our nature is to, subvert ourselves, to expand ourselves, to be more fluid, as it were, if you see what I mean. So so that whole premise of, if we create an AI intelligence, will it also be human, or will it rise up and kill us? And is it a threat? There's something very philosophically conservative about that, right? Because it does assume a stable, fixed notion of humanity that harkens back to, I think, kind of a modern or even a pre-modern theological notion of what it means to be human. And so the novel, Shelley's novel, does deal with that dynamic, I think. But I think for us, 200 years after her book was published, for us, we're so beaten over the head with this theme that we're kind of sick of it. Which, by the way, I think why I really liked the newer Blade Runner film, Blade Runner 2049, because they didn't even go to that question. Are replicants real, or are they, fake? Is Harrison Ford's character a replicant? Because if you go and watch that film again, Ryan Gosling's character asks Harrison Ford, "Oh, is your dog real?" And Harrison Ford just says, "I don't know. Why don't you ask him?" Right? The point being, enough already, right? Enough of this. Is this human? Is this real? Is it fake? Because these distinctions are, of course, constructs, and they're not very helpful. So I'm going to stop rambling in a second, but personally, I don't think, we're going to have Judgment Day like in Terminator, where suddenly one day things will, the robots will rise up or whatever it is. We're not going to have the Jurassic Park moment either, where, the dinosaurs start eating us. And so I'm not too, I don't find the pop culture obsession with all of this that persuasive. I mean, at least in terms of it being a prediction, if you see what I mean. What interests me more is why we can't seem to shake this obsession culturally, right? Because we're obsessed with it in our at least in our pop culture, right? Films and books and so on. It's entertaining, it's fascinating. We can't seem to just let it go and move on to something else, which is a bit strange.
Thank you. Yeah, that kind of leads to another question that I wanted to ask, if nobody else has any questions, which is that as a society, why are we never bored of the uncanny? And why does it always have the capacity not only to entertain us, but to literally obsess us and seize us in the way that it does, right from before Mary Shelley's time? That's probably why the novel became so pulp in a way, because it hinged on this obsession with the uncanny.
So I'm sort of drawing on Borna's allusion to, sort of an existentialist reading of the novel, but maybe a source of that endless fascination with uncanniness is the fact that our human existence is basically uncanny, right? That there is this sense in which we are a thing and not a thing, right? If you want to talk in terms of body and that which isn't body, call it mind, right? And there's a sense in which, and this is maybe something that Borna and I didn't talk enough about, there's a sense in which in the novel, what we're left with is at the end, a realization that that Victor is the monster, right? There's something monstrous about who Victor is and what Victor has done and the way that he's done it, right? That's the source of the uncanniness of the novel, right? So we can focus on the monster and the uncanniness of the monster, but where that leads us to, or one of the places that leads us to, is back to the uncanniness of human existence.
That's a really good answer. Yeah, because I always find Victor like so much more grating and annoying and like just, you know, like I want to slap the character a bit for many reasons. And just, you know, give him a good shake. And the monster, you know, obviously I think a lot of people do have certain sympathies with the monster, especially considering your sort of two readings. But that's a very good point. Yeah, humanness is uncanny in itself. I'm just going to read some comments from the chat from Fidel Costco, who says, what it means to be human arguably is bound up in our relationship to the natural substrate. The modern Prometheus arises at the historical moment where there's a new mode, maybe human domination of nature rather than dependence on it. Could some of the panelists contextualize the excellent readings against this present moment of eco-millenarian anxiety? And they also said Marx's metabolic rift and the questions of the historical shifting unbound interface between the social and natural.
Yeah, I mean, those are both excellent comments. So what it means to be human, yeah, so I think it is, of course, bound up with our relationship to the natural world in some sense. But of course, what it means to be human, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure if this is what you meant by your comment. So that question is also a historical question, because it as you know, it changes depending on the historical context and so on. So, you know, it's not a ahistorical or non-historical question or answer. This is why there's no human nature, right? So that seems to be right to me. So you're asking if we could maybe contextualize the readings against the present moment of eco-millenarian anxiety. Well, what do you mean by eco-millenarian anxiety? Are you what do you refer to? Because that's not clear to me.
Yeah, sorry, it's a bit of word salad. I'm kind of thinking out loud. I guess I was, I'm loving this, first of all. And you know, I think Shelley was writing somewhere well into the Industrial Revolution. All of the anxieties or all of the possible readings and tensions that you guys are bringing up are contained, you know, and are still recognizable at this point. We're still dealing with these relations of class and race and colonization and gender, and what our relationship with technology and the promises of that, but also the problems. But it's become a lot more stark lately. I mean, all of those anxieties are present in these, you know, romantic and modernist texts and thinking, but you know, what was sort of a prophetic premonition about where things were heading in the 19th century is quite dire now. And I just wonder, well, I was hoping to get you guys to do the work of what are the relevances of the problems presented by the novel and the kinds of philosophical readings possible, or sort of like solutions, I guess, given that the stakes are so high now that I don't want to be too dire, but yeah, we're already experiencing really catastrophic effects of a very, you know, unhealthy and dysfunctional relationship nature, and I would name it as capitalism, that kind of thing. But if, you know, maybe I'm just stating the obvious, and I don't know whether there's any ground to work.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I'll just be brief, and then if Corey wants to add something, you know, he can. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to point out that obviously we're still, in some ways, we are still grappling with the ideas and themes that Shelley was grappling with in her time and in the novel, right? That's certainly true. But of course, the kind of, I mean, the cliched progressivism or historical progressivism is sort of, no one really buys into that anymore for good reason. And but of course also, I mean, this goes back to maybe the kind of more obvious reading of the novel, of course, which is, well, this is the warning of the book, right? Shelley's saying, wait a minute, yes, scientific endeavor, experimentation, you know, a man's quest for knowledge, all of that good Enlightenment stuff, great. But here's a complication. What if there's something, you know, what if there's something destructive in progress, right? What if there's something destructive in the quest for knowledge? And to your point, and this is, you know, I mean, this is what you were speaking about, right? We can kind of think about the monster or the story, you know, as a parable that's analogous to, I mean, not our quest for knowledge, but our quest for profit, right? I mean, look at the craziness that the pandemic has wrought, and capital is not able to really handle a pandemic. You know, people are unemployed, they're starving. The economy must go on, but we're sacrificing human beings, human lives, right? So it's, at least from a capitalistic perspective, or at least from, let's say, a Marxist critique of capitalism, from that perspective, it seems to me that, after all, capital, as you know, is a human construct. So we've created capitalism, right? So in a sense, I mean, I don't want to be too simplistic about it, but in a sense, you can see how that fits nicely with kind of Shelley's point about Victor creating something that then turns around and starts killing human beings, right? So there's that anxiety, let's call it, that is very much present with us now as we're sitting here on Zoom talking to each other. I'm not sure there's a real solution, at least not in the novel, at least not obviously in the novel. I mean, all I would say would be that in terms of our own historical moment, what's clear is that capital and capitalism cannot kind of solve the problems it creates, right? Which is why I'm a Marxist personally. So but in relation to nature, I mean, we're kind of living through that now, right? The way capitalism is dominating and exploiting nature has really dire consequences for everyone, as we can see. So in that sense, the theme of the novel is very much still important, I think.
I want to just add there, this was actually going to be a question to Borna and Corey, but I think it makes sense kind of as a response to some of what you were just asking, that I feel like in terms of, you know, human domination of nature and this conservative reading where Mary Shelley is saying, like, we need to be careful and not try to play God and dominate nature because ultimately it goes wrong. I think actually specifically in a way, or this is how I read it, specifically she's talking about a very kind of masculinist strand of scientism, you know, where everything is very aggressive, everything's dominatory, rather than kind of interactive or experimental. And I was actually going to ask Borna and Corey, is Mary Shelley an unashamed soft girl contra the toxic masculinity of her day? And can we say that Frankenstein was her argument against, not necessarily against all experimentation or interaction with so-called nature, but a particular masculine, sort of presumptuous, harmful form of it that's dominatory and presupposes that we're in essential opposition with the so-called natural rather than entangled within it. So I feel like she's kind of saying, I mean, anyone can wade in with this, but I feel like she's kind of saying not all interaction with nature is bad, not all experimentation with nature is bad, but this very sort of like dominatory, almost like separatist sort of, you know, we are intrinsically estranged from nature, but we're going to own it. I feel like that's what she's sort of speaking against. That's just a little addition there.
I mean, so one of the things that strikes me when I read the novel and when I would teach the novel is, and this sort of gets to the question you were just asking, is how much it's a novel about the possibility and the impossibility of human relationships, right? And so we sort of get so focused on the scientific question, the question of domination over nature, the questions of, you know, the sort of moral and scientific questions of the book, that we sort of forget, and I think this is what most of the film adaptations do too, we forget that this is a novel about how we can, you know, we can fail to relate to each other. And so that might be a possible way, or that'd be one way that I'd get at this question, right? How do we think of non-dominating relationships? What sorts of non-dominating relationships are present in the novel, and how do these non-dominating relationships get transformed into ones that are sort of trapped in this dynamic of dominator and dominated, right? That's sort of you know, on many readings at the heart of the novel between Frankenstein as monster.
Brilliant, thank you, Corey. At this point, I just want to ask if anyone else has any questions or kind of wants to change the topic of discussion before I sort of launch into another question. Anyone? Now's your chance. Okay, well, don't complain then if you're bored. So I wanted to basically also ask a question about physiognomy and philosophy, basically, where physiognomy is kind of judging a book by its cover. So judging the character of things by their appearance. And that was something that was still actually seriously practiced at large in Mary Shelley's day. And you can see that in the novel, just in the way that the creature is described, and in the way that, like, you know, part of people's hate and fear of the creature is really premised on the creature's looks. And then in contrast to somebody like the character of Elizabeth, which is Victor Frankenstein's fake cousin / love interest, who's described as like very beautiful and looking like a cherub, and also happens to be like really kind and perfect and wonderful. And I was just kind of thinking with regards to that, you know, a lot of people picture, when they think of Frankenstein's monster, that kind of Boris Karloff monster that we were talking about before, this sort of aesthetico-typical monster that Borna would say is the sort of this cultural imprint of what the monster looks like. But personally, I feel like I can never actually fix upon any kind of coherent image in my mind. So when I'm reading, it keeps changing. And that in itself is kind of, it's like a grain of discomfort and annoyance, even in my reading experience, because I'm like, let me just imagine the monster and move on to the next sentence. But I have to like spend some time, like, and maybe that's the point, and what makes it unsettling, being its kind of lack of comprehensible, even physical form, hinting at its rendering stark of this kind of ontological boundlessness, as Borna might say, this void. So how does everybody, this is open to everyone actually, not just Borna and Corey, how does everybody picture the creature, and how might that influence your and other people's philosophical considerations?
So I wanted to, before we get to that question, I sort of wanted to respond to this this dimension of the visible or the physiognomic that you mentioned, by pointing to a moment in the novel where, so this is in the second volume, where the monster is sort of relating to Victor what's happened to him, how he learned to, to read and write and so on and so forth, right? And, it's kind of a far-fetched story where he's, sort of spying on his family. He's, outside their hovel, and, there's some books there, and he reads these books, Paradise Lost and all this other stuff. But it's interesting, I think, in relationship to this question of visibility, that the old man is blind. And so when the monster works up his nerve to approach the old man, right, and his, the two kids, the adult children are away. So he approaches the old blind man, talks to him. The blind man sort of takes pity on him, wants to know more about him, doesn't recognize him as monstrous, right? Thinks he might not be from around here. He doesn't, do you speak French, and so on and so forth. But it's only when the children come back, right, and they look with horror on, who their father's talking to, father-in-law, something like that, that the monster is recognized as a monster, right? So I think that this whole question of visibility, what's seen and unseen, is really important for what Shelley's doing, not just in terms of that creation scene that Borna, describes so well, but also later in the novel when the old blind man, feels bad for the monster, until that moment that the people who can see his horrible appearance see him and realize that he's a monster, right? So the monster has to be seen.
That's a really fantastic point. Yeah, that is absolutely true. He's like squatting in this hovel, mm-hmm. like a sad little dog that they don't know they have, and then he reveals himself to the blind father, but of course he can't reveal his appearance because the father or father-in-law is blind. And then the kids all come back and they're like, oh, well, like, who have you been hanging out with? What the hell? Let's get out of here. Yeah, that's a really great point. So how do you picture the creature?
So when I would talk about it, I introduced the idea of the uncanny valley, and because some students had heard of this, other students hadn't, but I think that gets at sort of what's this sort of indeterminability of the monster, right? Maybe he doesn't really look all that monstrous at all, but he just doesn't quite look human. Now, that sort of uncanny valley reading is sort of undercut by the way that Shelley has Victor describe the monster and the monster's hideousness, but it could just be sort of an affected, right? He recoils in horror, not necessarily because of what he sees, but because the monster looks almost human, but not quite. And so that's how I sort of, get students to think about that really interesting idea of the uncanny valley in terms of the creation scene.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just maybe the creature is at that kind of peak of intersection between like mm-hmm. just human looking enough and just non-human looking enough to arouse that level of like abject sort of disgust and fear. Whereas when it gets into the realm of ridiculous, or so far away from human, that's when people are just like, in a way, maybe scared sometimes, but definitely less unsettled. And that's also, I think before, when we just spoke previously, Borna was talking about the kind of film representations as being like this sort of ridiculous thing that is just like all costume and no substance.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I don't. I mean, personally, whenever I'm reading the book, I don't really. I mean, I don't really have a visual representation of the creature in my head when I'm reading the novel. It's just sort of not really there. But of course, culturally, we are saturated by this image of Frankenstein, the Boris Karloff image with the bolts in the head and everything. But I don't like that, and I mean, I don't think any of these representations are really adequate, unfortunately. And okay, yes, Shelley does write, yellow skin, yellow eyes, black hair, but that's not okay. Fine, the creature can have that those features, but it's not very scary. You know what I mean? Okay, he has some bad surgery scars, but it's fine. There's nothing scary or frightening about that. So yeah, so I mean, as you know, for me the monster's appearance isn't enough to kind of, I suppose, grasp or capture the horrific nature of the novel, which is kind of frustrating for me because, every time I hear there's another film or another adaptation of the novel, I'm kind of interested because I think, oh, maybe this time they'll get it right and kind of capture something, do something different. But I'm always disappointed personally.
That's really funny, and so that you would say that. I don't really picture the monster. The monster is literally like a hole, like a void you're picturing the rest of the scene, like this lovely lake scene in Geneva, and then there's just like a black hole in the middle of it. I'm just going to read out some comments. So Sam says, I imagine the monster differently throughout the book. I only see him as monstrous when there is a human perceiving him as such, although not all the time. For example, when I see the contrast of Victor and the monster, when the monster describes himself, I visualize him as fully human, even if ugly, his mind feels human. I don't know, I hadn't really considered this before, so these thoughts are not ordered. No, that's a good point. I think I'm very similar in that way. The monster kind of changes. Linda says, in my mind, the monster is always Robert De Niro. Poor you. That's really unfortunate. And Fidel Costco also says, as I recall, there's ambivalence, the mixture of attraction and revulsion, abject because of our inability to integrate our feeling and relate to it. Yeah, for sure. Would anybody else like to weigh in with their kind of take on the monster? So presumably nobody sees it as this Boris Karloff kind of character when they're seriously considering it, or if you're reading, for those that have read the novel, while you're reading, you're not picturing like this ridiculous, like green, kind of greenish looking thing with like the bolts and stuff.
One of the interesting questions I think would be, and I don't know the film history enough to answer it, but how did this become the sort of iconic visual representation of the monster? Because there's no way you can get to the Boris Karloff monster from the description in the novel. So that would be something I'd want to investigate further.
That's a good point. It's probably some costume designer and like, makeup artist specializing in prosthetics. So I don't know if that was my internet signal there, but I might have just cut out. Can everybody still?
Second,
yeah, okay. I think I have slightly dodgy signal. Let me know, by the way, if that happens and I'm just like stuck and in the middle of something. Somebody just say in the chat, because I think that does happen to me from time to time.
It was monstrous and you were frozen in a nice but scary smile.
Yeah, I kind of like fell into the glitch void. Maybe you had the horror of like my black lipstick just sort of spreading across the screen. Sorry, everyone. So at this point, I just kind of want to, well, there are some more comments actually, so I'll read the comments. Linda says, when I first read it, I was struck how the monster speaks perfect, crisp English. Yeah, so the monster's acquisition of language is a bit tenuous. As Corey was saying, the monster kind of squats in this hovel and picks up language through somebody else, like a daughter-in-law or something from somewhere else, being taught the language and so on. But it isn't English, obviously. It's set in Geneva mostly, that part. But yes, obviously Mary Shelley probably spoke a very crisp English herself, and so that's obviously reflected in the monster. But that's a good point. Halidonto says maybe there is no monster; it's delusion from Victor's mind of his own mental health. That is a kind of quite a popular take. I would say a lot of people probably do interpret it in a slightly Jekyll and Hyde kind of way. Sam is also saying about, I think about the film, the kind of Hollywood treatment of the monster, which is sadly the one that's kind of persisted in popular culture, as these things do. So at this point, I just want to ask if anybody else has any questions, because we're kind of coming up to when we would probably close. But if anybody has any questions that they want to just, step in and ask themselves now, or if you're shy and you want me to ask it, now's your time. Anyone?
I think Linda has a question about Gnosticism.
Oh, yeah. Linda says, I joined late. Anyone discuss Gnosticism and Frankenstein? That's a really good point, because there is this kind of like this base element, and then this kind of like rising to the light kind of ideas about what constitutes a kind of almost godly ascension. But if Borna and Corey or anybody else wants to wade in, go for it. That's really interesting.
So I haven't read any Gnostic interpretations, but it sounds really plausible that you could have, you could sort of read Victor as this demiurge making this mangled creation, and so that would sort of tie into the quasi-religious, or the moral interpretation that I was talking a little bit about to begin with, that I sort of call the conservative interpretation. Another important aspect of this, and I'm still working my way through this really brilliant book by a literary scholar named Jared Hickman called Black Prometheus. And so that's where I was getting some of the characterizations of resistance and stuff, borrowing from him. And so he wants to say that this Prometheus myth gets historicized in the 18th and 19th centuries. But it gets historicized in a couple of different ways. It gets historicized as a figure of whiteness, right? So that historically Prometheus, according to this white Promethean story in the Caucasus Mountains, right? This is where Prometheus is. And this gives rise to a sort of political theology of white Prometheus that sees whiteness as superior, and this sort of racial hierarchy following from that. But then there's this counter narrative of a black Prometheus situated somewhere in North Africa, and this becomes the basis for anti-slavery narratives, Frederick Douglass, and so on and so forth. So that's another way. It's not, I don't think Hickman does, if I recall, it doesn't do much with Gnosticism, but he's looking at another way that another sort of belief system, or what you call, in the case of Prometheus, a myth, gets historicized in a way that's relevant for thinking about Frankenstein.
Yeah, and I mean, I would just, because Linda's commented about, Gnosticism as the world and its creation being inherently evil and full of suffering. The monster suffers from having been created. Yeah, well, I mean, as anyone who's read the novel probably knows, so that theme, the theme of creator and creation, or God and God's children and so on, is something that Shelley is commenting on, right? And so I think in the book, the creature actually reads Milton at some point, Paradise Lost, I believe. And of course, this is a huge influence on Shelley herself. And so it's from what I remembered, there's that passage in Milton where, human beings are cursing their God and are cursing their creator. How dare you? You didn't ask me if I wanted to be created. There's no consent, which is the rage that humanity has against God and so on. And that's clearly in the novel, of course. The monster, the creature is full of rage and hate and anger. And I think he says at one point to Victor, he says, you've damned me to be an outcast and to be rejected by humanity. And I think it's the point in the novel where he says, well, I'm going to try to live apart from humanity. Create me a mate. I want a bride, or I want a partner. And Victor denies the monster, the creature, the mate or the partner. So it's so that the allusion, I suppose, to humanity cursing God, cursing our creator for having created us to suffer, right, is definitely something that is very prescient and very current in the book and in the story. And Shelley was definitely thinking about that as well. I mean, we didn't talk about the theological aspect of it too much, but it's I mean, the question for us is, for a mostly secular culture, what does the theological reading of the novel mean? Does it have any more meaning? After Nietzsche, God is now dead. What is this Gnostic, as it were, or theological protest that the creature has against Victor, or rather that humanity has against God if God is now dead, right? I mean, philosophically speaking. So that's an interesting question. I don't really have an answer. Because of course, Victor himself as a character does see himself as, kind of this superior, very genius human being. He sees himself above the other scientists. So he has a God complex, right? He has a big ego. And so in a sense, the monster or the creature himself develops a big ego. So in terms of domination and masculine, like in terms of toxic masculinity, they're both very toxic individuals, right? Both Victor and the monster are very kind of nasty, dominating, horrible individuals, really. And I mean, Victor, at least in the beginning of the novel, Victor does describe his childhood as being kind of innocent and, fine. So they were innocent in some sense in their childhood, but both became kind of corrupted and egotistic and so on. But anyway, yes, there's a lot there, and I'm sure people have written about it, but it's not something that we really touched upon too much. But yes, it's definitely something that Shelley really, I mean, it's obvious that she wanted to kind of imbue the novel with these theological themes and ideas, which is interesting.
I'm just reading a comment from Linda here. And she says, he is very similar to the Gnostic demiurge, extremely arrogant and full of hubris. Victor is absolutely toxic. Yeah, I mean, I agree. He's super annoying. If I were the creature, I would kill him too. But but that's a really interesting line of thought, because I do know that a lot of people, I think, well, quite a few people have actually written essays on this, because I noted this to myself. I read an essay that mentioned this sort of Gnostic take on the novel, and I thought that sounds interesting. I'll look at that at some point. I haven't yet, unfortunately, but it did make me think of a kind of Bataillean take on it as well, looking at base materialism, where Victor makes the creature out of corpses, out of like rotten corpses, and he talks a lot about worms at that time. And he basically at a certain point just says, yeah, well, we're all food for worms, which is like my new favorite quote. Anyway, we're all just food for worms. But yeah, I think that's kind of, it kind of intersects with the Gnostic take of like everything's dirty and evil and awful. But Bataille doesn't qualify it in the same way. He just uses that as a kind of as a device to undermine the kind of loftiness of you know, Enlightenment ideas and so on and so forth, and to kind of like upend stupid binaries. So it's not with the same kind of psychology, I would say, as the Gnostics. But I don't know if anybody else actually knows more about that. Well, thank you, Linda. That was very interesting. Okay, so we're kind of at a point where we could close. But I would like to ask if anybody has any more questions, or they just want to make a statement about their take on the novel or anything that we've talked about today.
Hi, I would like to share something. I'm not sure if this is the right take, or I guess I'm just wondering what you guys think about my take. That maybe because these monsters represent the, you know, people on the fringes of society and outcasts and like all these monsters, Frankenstein and witches and werewolves, and wondering, because this reality is based in like a polarized nature, and if this represents that part of ourselves that is maybe not accepted, and that's what's so horrifying, that maybe the unification of these two different polarities, and that's like not what this reality is based on, so it horrifies us.
Well, I mean, I'm just curious what you mean by like when you say polarization, you mean like Victor and the monster? Like, are they the polarized aspects?
Yeah, represented in that story, but yeah, like in the sense of our reality, like for example, a push and pull, or you know, like yin and yang, black and white, and I guess it's more not
right, okay,
like on an individual level instead of like on a societal level, but also our push and pull with ourselves and, you know, the dark side of our own psyche.
Yes, I mean, I think that makes sense to me, you know, because I can easily see what you're saying. I mean, clearly, you know, yes, the creature could represent kind of the darkest sides of Victor himself in some sense, you know, parts of himself that he ignores, maybe on a psychological level, you know, the kind of the manifestation of his own psyche in that sense. And maybe that's also why he's repelled by it, because he's confronted. I mean, you can give a whole psychoanalytic interpretation. I'm sure people have done this, where you kind of say, well, look, the monster represents Victor's own darkest, deepest desires, and he's horrified and disgusted at himself when he sees the monster, right? So there's and I mean, you can do the flip side, where from the creature's perspective, Victor represents everything the creature is not, right? The creature is not human, is not accepted into society. And so that's why they kind of hate each other, because their hate is maybe they hate themselves, but the other represents that part of themselves that they hate. So their hate is kind of, if you like, mediated, right, by the other person. It's kind of, you're projecting your hate onto someone else and it bounces back and hits you in the face. So you can, you can kind of see it as that maybe. And this is, the end of the book is always weird to me. Whenever I read the novel, the last paragraph or the last few paragraphs is such a ridiculous ending, because the book ends, as Corey mentioned in his talk, with Victor, warning Walton not to give into ambition. And then Walton says, yes, I saw him go out into the snow, because they're in the Antarctic, remember, with the snow and the ice and everything. And Victor is going to find the creature and they're going to just basically fight to their death. And then the book ends. And you go, what kind of an ending is that? That's so depressing. I mean, they just kill each other in the ice? Or does Victor succeed? Maybe he never finds the monster. I mean, who knows? But it ends in such a desperate way. It also ends in a very desperate place. It's in the Arctic where there's no life. It's just ice. And where things are frozen. So it's almost as if the battle that Victor has with the creature is kind of frozen for all time in the Antarctic in that way, symbolically. So it's a really bizarre ending.
It is, except there's a third person that you mentioned, and that's Walton, right? And Walton is this, he has grand designs to be this Arctic explorer, maybe exploiter as well, right? But after his, interactions, getting to know Victor and Victor's story, and seeing the monster, he quits that, right? He goes home, right? And so maybe that's a way of, if we remember that, Walton's the guy who's really telling the story through Victor and through the monster, right? Maybe that's a way of thinking about what happens to this toxic masculinity stuff, right? It's Walton decides, okay, I'm going to go home. I'm not going to try to conquer this wasteland. I'm going to give that up.
Victor kind of warns Walton, doesn't he? He says, don't go there. I've been there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I've done toxic masculinity and I've done it to its nth degree, and actually everyone, all my friends and family first started to think I was awful, and then started to worry about me, and then they all died anyway. So it's kind of it's kind of quite a stark warning. But yeah, maybe Walton is the answer. Maybe it's dabble in a bit of nature experimentation, but don't go too far. Dabble in a bit of knowledge acquisition, but don't go too far. I don't know if Mary Shelley's advocating a kind of moderate approach, because she is far less radical than her parents are politically. Her parents were kind of the radicals of their day, and she had this kind of softer approach to things, where she actually valued, her mother was this kind of rationalist, feminist, ball breaker of the day. And she sort of actually, Mary Shelley advocated just, concentrate on your loved ones. She advocated kind of putting your all into domesticity, into your sort of small scale relationships, rather than kind of really striking out and trying to achieve something massive in the way that kind of both of her parents did, sort of. But then she did also even more, because people, I would say, she kind of did accidentally in a way. That in itself is interesting.
You mean in terms of the legacy of her work?
Yeah, she's kind of, I would say, definitely more famous than her father. Quite a lot of people know who Wollstonecraft was, but I would say people are more aware of Mary Shelley. And she didn't want that fame. There are accounts of her journals where she's just when I was young, I thought I might quite like a bit of fame, because Percy told me I might quite like it, and he wanted me to prove that I was a good writer. And actually, her fame ironically outstripped his. And I mean, I know he's obviously a very famous poet, but I would say en masse, not everybody reads poetry, and not everybody's read Frankenstein, but do people know about Frankenstein? Do people know Frankenstein's monster? Yes, they do. Have people heard of Percy Shelley's poetry? Have people read Queen Mab? Probably not. So yeah, I don't know, she kind of accidentally like won in a way she didn't want to.
Yeah, who sold more? I rest my case.
Definitely Mary. So Linda, I'm just reading a comment from Linda here as well. That she says, I don't know if for me it's about being moderate as it is about a man trying to get the power to create life. Women create life. Percy Shelley's poetry is god awful for me. I'll pass. I got forced to read some at school and wasn't my favorite. Wasn't the worst either, but other people are saying stuff that I could read out. Sam said, I'm wondering what the significance might be of the monster's construction from separate body parts. What the significance might be within this or any other interpretation. Stories that end in the Antarctic, The Thing, Snowpiercer, etc.
Yeah, well, I mean the body part thing is because remember Victor, like his motivation in the story is he wants to create, you know, like I mean, he says at one point, you know, he could be the father of a new species, right? He wants to create like a perfect specimen. And so that's why he goes on this kind of a selection process where he's trying to pick, you know, the best arms and the best neck and head and all the rest of it. So, well, it's a bit creepy, of course, because like, you know, here's this like weird nerdy guy who is like hanging around the city, but he's not really a scientist, but he's like creeping around, you know, digging up, you know, corpses and going to the morgue and so on. But you know, it's this, you know, it's the creation of the, it's the pursuit of perfection, the you know, the pursuit of the best, which is of course, as we all know, unobtainable. And you know, Victor makes that realization when he, yes, there's also a eugenic element to it as well, which is why it's probably very creepy. And it's yeah, and so Victor essentially realizes that, okay, well, this kind of perfect specimen that I tried to create is not really perfect at all. Yes, I mean, there's this whole kind of discourse or line of interpretation that's more that is based around biopower and you know, biological life, and the question of life and death, and the question of the creation of life. You know, you can do it theologically. You could do it in terms of a women creating life. You know, Victor not being a biological woman, but being a, you know, straight man. You know, Linda said maybe this is why Victor messes up, because he's a man trying to create life and he goes horribly wrong, which is probably true in some sense, I would say. You know, he's a very arrogant man, right? And so, I mean, yes, I mean, just that, you know, just the kind of use of biology in the story is interesting, and it's been written about. There are lots of papers that deal with that issue, you know, the kind of philosophical and ethical implications of using biological life and biological science, or natural science as it was called back then, or rather natural philosophy. I mean, it was called natural philosophy. You know, so there's lots of things to say about that, but you know, I'm not sure we have a lot of time for it. Plus, I haven't done all the readings myself, so.
I just wanted to add that this idea of the monster being composed of disparate parts that Victor scavenges, this becomes important for the political readings, the various political readings of the novel, right? Because it's the idea of the constitution of the body politic and so on and so forth. You know, that's a way that the monster becomes sort of a ready metaphor for these various political readings.
That's a really great point about the monster and the body politic, because I was sort of thinking about that before, and thinking about something that Eugene Thacker wrote about reapproaching the body politic when thinking about governance. And I mean, I read it quite a while ago, and I'm probably botching it in my sort of summary, but I think he's sort of advocating going back to this kind of mereological part-whole relation approach, rather than considering, you know, an entirely diverse group of people as a whole, especially in terms of bio or necropolitical governance. And I cannot remember what that essay was called. It's an old essay from like maybe 2012 or something in some book, but if you just typed in necropolitics, Eugene Thacker, body politic, you would probably find it or find where to find it. But yes, that's an interesting point about the body politic. And I think the monster is a really sort of like graphic consideration, could be construed as quite a like graphic sort of and violent consideration of that. Also, Fidel Costco says the question of masculine gestation recalls the scene from Terminator 2, where the heroine rails against male envy of the feminine gift of life and birth, leading only to destruction and death. Does anybody have any more questions or any more points that they'd like to make? Because soon I will probably wrap it up, as we're getting to 9 o'clock here in the UK, 9 p.m. And I know it's probably getting late where some of the rest of you are, or you might have stuff to do. But does anybody have any last words, comments, questions?
I just wanted to thank everybody for attending and for the great questions and the great discussion.
Thank you for presenting to us. It was really great. Thank you, both of you. And thank you, everybody that attended, because I know, you know, times are hard and all of our lives are probably like chaotic and stressful, and we have a million unpleasant things to deal with. So we do appreciate you joining us tonight. Borna, any last words?
I just want to say thank you to both of you, Sabine, and to Sepideh for an object for curating and hosting this. It's been a lot of fun for me, and thanks, Corey, for partnering up and talking about this. I love this stuff. I think it's fascinating. Thanks to everyone who participated and asked questions. And hopefully we can do this again someday, hopefully in person somewhere. So thanks.
Thank you, Sabine and Borna and Corey, for an amazing talk.
Thank you, Sepideh.
Sure.
Thank you, everyone. It was a super nice way to wake up. I'm just kidding.
Wake up.
Thank you so much, friends.
No problem.
Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Cool. All right. I'm going to sign off, but have a good evening and happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween, everyone. I'm going to go to sleep.
Hey, everybody.
Happy Day of the Dead. Dios de Muertos.